All right, we're live. Accumulated Knowledge, episode 4. Ready to talk about some tournament preparation. And this episode, we are probably going to start off with what we covered in the RC, just like our decks, preparation, etc. Kind of how to effectively prepare for a tournament. And then we'll cover your standard 75k. Um, and I think that's it. To start off, what did you begin considering for the RC Joseph?
I was very excited for this RC. Modern is a format that I like quite a bit. I've had some of my best results in Modern. I was coming off of winning the Magic Online Modern Showcase with Amulet Titan, which was a deck that I had picked up basically for that event. I spent about 5 or 6 days playing a bunch of Amulet and was very fortunate to get some good matchups and spike the event. I was intending to run Amulet back in at the RC, so I spent 2 or 3 weeks with some good friends and good Amulet players preparing and doing prep. But as the numbers started to come in closer to the event, looking at expected metagame and our results against certain matchups, it became more and more clear that I was not a diehard enough Amulet player to play it in this tournament. And the reason for that was Modern was sort of centralized around a big five of Murktide, Scam, Amulet, uh, Rhinos, and help me out, Derek. I'm forgetting one. Yawgmoth.
Yeah, there you go.
Um, and out of all of those, the mirror is a wash, obviously. Although I think the mirror is a little bit of some moves that people don't often think about, but it's a mirror. Yawgmoth, I'm happy to play against as Amulet. The mirror is a wash. The other three matchups you actively don't want to play against, I think. You have moves, obviously, but they're not good matchups.
Well,
And
okay, so you're specifically speaking to like Team Rhinos, Murktide, and
Scam.
Scam. I felt like Amulet was favored in the Scam. Is that not where you landed?
That's not where I ended up. It depends. It depends mostly on how many moon effects they have.
Hmm.
But leading up to the RC, you started to see a lot of a 1-2 split. So you'd see one moon in the main and then another moon in the board. And it's not unplayable. Certainly, if you bring like a Wormcoil engine and some spelunkings, it can be acceptable. But it's definitely, I think it's not a good matchup for Amulet.
Interesting. Okay, I played a bunch of this versus Tristan. I think we played like a 12 or 15 game set, and
Tristan is
I only won games where I grief scammed. Like every game I did not grief scam, I lost. It
Sounds about
was
right.
it was really rough because I was also grief scamming above average. Like I think I grief scammed 4 or 5 games out of like 12 or something, and then the other seven I just all lost. 7 or 8, whatever. I didn't have a winning record while grief scamming like 40% of the time.
Flash forward to the future
Right.
where some post tournament, I've played some interesting games against Tristan. Has a very unique amulet list and
Hmm.
plays it quite a bit differently than the average amulet player
Sure.
for generous ends, um, which makes the matchups different. But I think I'm not excited to play against Scam as amulet.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I mean, do you think if let's just say even if you think it's bad, if it was favored, would that change your stance on playing Amulet for this event?
It would help. So the biggest, I think I switched off of it for two main reasons. The biggest of which was I didn't want to be playing a deck that had a negative matchup into the three of the five most popular decks in the room.
Mm-hmm.
the diehard Amulet players are going to play it anyway and have success. But I was not in a position to be one of those players. So if
Right.
I thought Amulet was poorly positioned, I didn't want to play it. Then the second reason was sort of the actual mechanics of the deck in paper is harder for me than it is online. Um, this is sort of a weird thing with some of these combo decks, especially one where I haven't played 10,000 games with them. You know, if I'm sitting at home, I can count out loud, oh, I play this tapped land, and then I make 2 mana, and then I bounce it, and then I make 4 mana, and then, you know, you can plot out all of your lines verbally. Whereas playing in paper, it's a lot harder to visualize the end state of all of these long chains. And Amulet is very punishing because, unlike some other, you know, a mid range deck, where you can sort of have a general plan and then you take some game actions and you see where things end up. Amulet, if you fetch the wrong land off of your first Titan trigger, you lose.
Yeah, you're done.
And you actually can lose. Like you can end up not
No,
being
yeah.
able to pay for your pack, or
I've died to
like
my own
making
pack trigger
yes.
an embarrassing amount while trying to learn Titan for this RC. But yeah, I think there's a lot of complexities here. Something that I think you were getting to, which was that you thought Amulet was bad in a Rhinos, right?
I think
Is
that's
that part of it?
well. I think that's true. Yeah.
Right, right. So to piggyback off that, when do you think it's acceptable to play a deck that is bad into the like S tier level one? I guess actually, I don't think I like using either of those terms. I would say, when are you okay playing a deck that is bad into the expected most represented deck at a tournament? Like the Teamer Rhinos, the. I'm trying to think if there was like a most. Oh, the Black Red mid range for the Pioneer. Like, when will you say, okay, well, I may have a bad matchup versus the top deck, but maybe I like beat three others and only lose to two of them. Like, where's that line for you? Is it one bad matchup in the top five and then four good ones? Because that sounds like a theoretically broken deck. Is it three good matchups and two bad ones? How do you feel that out?
Uh, I think I think if I feel ahead against the field as a whole, then I'm definitely happy to play the deck, even if it's the most popular deck is its bad matchup. Just like I think this is a classic pattern you see of best deck, counter deck, and the counter deck can lose to the best deck but prey on everything else. Um,
I honestly kind of feel like that's where Amulet's at in the modern metagame.
I think that is where it's at. Um, the problem for me was just Amulet has the unmatched win rate against the other bracket,
Right.
right? Where it just feasts on all of the decks except for Mill that are not in the top sort of five.
Right. I mean, also, like, we were in this weird loop in Modern where it's like Rhinos was really big, and then all the decks that came up to beat Rhinos just got, like, stomped by Amulet, right? I'm thinking of stuff like, oh God, what's that horrid, um, like, Coffers deck, right? That they were playing with,
Yeah,
like, a bunch of, like, main deck chalices. Like, just a bunch of, like, garbage that blue white control I have to imagine is really good for Amulet, right?
the Coffers matchup can be a little sus because of their fields, but it's good. Yeah,
Okay, okay. Um yeah, I don't know. That totally makes sense to me. So you were kind of like feeling out Amulet and then you switched to Rhinos and you switched to Rhinos because you thought it had a better spread than Amulet. Um was there a
kind of.
Whoa, go ahead.
Sorry, I just the thing that really switched me over to Rhinos is I started playing some more with the deck, and I actually went on a couple of long walks where I was just thinking about how the Rhinos deck, you know, paired up in all these matchups. And I still think this is true to some extent, although we have seen like an overcorrection maybe. But specifically for that weekend, the Rhinos deck had no bad matchups. Like there was nothing. or that's like an over exaggeration. But there was nothing that anybody was doing that the Rhinos deck didn't have moves for.
Right.
You a Chalice deck, okay, Flame of Anor, Boseiju, Brazen Borrower. Are you trying to come at them with counter spells? Flash Game is great. You know, we have redundant alternative threats. We'll grind you out, etc.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of the largest appeals of or not Murktide, Rhinos actually, is that how many moves and resilience it has, even around hate. It kind of reminds me. Have you played like the Grinding Breach deck in Modern?
Yes.
Where it kind of like it gets like people are always like, oh, the Shardless Agent into Fortune Negation lines are just so. And it's like, yes, the top end Rhino combo lines are gonna look very silly, but it's like the games where you just like play your third land on turn 3 and go, and you have like 5 cards you could be representing after you like dead gone to creature already, and then you like ice them to deny their like turn 2 play, and then now you've just like passed and you have so many options, and they like play something, and then you tidebinder it, and then you untap, and then now you get to play a Murktide or something like the fail case on Rhinos is what I'm trying to get at, is like super high compared to so many decks that it can almost feel like a combo mid-range deck.
Yeah, I think that's exactly, you know, I was listening to a lot of discourse where people were saying, even after the RC, people were talking about this where, wow, Rhinos did so well at the RC. I guess people didn't learn to put Chalice of the Void in their sideboard. It's like every deck had Chalice of the Void in their sideboard.
Yeah.
The answer is that's not enough. The
Yeah.
Rhinos can beat Chalice of the Void. And this is like a mind-blowing thing for people, but it's not, you know, Sanctifier and back against Scam or whatever. Rhinos is a well-rounded enough deck that it has moves.
Right, yeah, and it's like, especially if you're like playing the extra Boseiju and you're like playing a bunch of flames, it's just like, I don't know, you just have like 6 or 7 outs. I feel like this is almost the equivalent of when people say it's like, oh, I got my Chalice into play versus Delver, or like just very it's very typical when you're talking about Legacy for someone that's like, I don't want to say not very good, but you know, someone who maybe just plays Legacy at like an F&M level, and they're like, yeah, my deck beats Delver, and it's like, well, does it actually though? Because sure, you may like turn one Chalice of the Void some like Delver player that's like mulliganing improperly sometimes, but not only is there a large amount of disparity here, but both Delver as a deck and Rhinos as a deck are well rounded enough where they can basically fight through anything when the like deck building of it comes prepared for whatever you think the expected metagame will be. And it's been a known quantity for like multiple months at this point that Rhinos is a top deck, and then the response to that of increasing like Chalice of the Void numbers means that Rhinos players are going to be prepared for those Chalice of the Voids. Like it's a very known quantity. You're not putting some saucy secret sideboard tech into your deck to cheese them out.
Yeah, the matchups that are hard matchups that you lose are the ones that have Chalice like effects and then are also structurally difficult for you.
Yeah.
Beyond that, you know, just a random deck putting an extra Chalice in their sideboard is not going to move the needle.
4 Chalice of the Voids is not going to make your Merfolk versus Rhinos matchup good. I'm sorry. Like, totally. So, you kind of thought that Rhinos just had, like, both a theoretically more well-rounded deck and then also perhaps had a better spread. So, you picked up Rhinos, and then were you just hard locked on it? Was there any other real consideration, or were you just, like, in the nitty-gritty tuning phase at that point?
I was going to play one of those two decks, and that was sort of at the point where I'd played a lot of Amulet games, and I sort of knew that I had a good list. I had other people who were also working on the deck and were putting together good plans. So if I decided at the last minute that, I don't know, I looked on TCG Player and 14,000 copies of the card Living End had been purchased in the last 24 hours.
Wait, you can see that?
No, but
Oh, okay.
I don't know, if for some reason I decided not to play Rhinos, I knew that I could fall back on Amulet. but I was pretty locked on, I was playing a lot of the deck at that time over the last week, and it was performing really, really well. It felt really well oiled, and I sort of most wanted to see if I could get an edge in the mirror, and if I felt like I could have an edge in the mirror, then I would play the deck.
Right. Was there what's like your general idea for trying to get an edge in the mirror? Because my experience for this event was that part of the reason that I was kind of low on just stock rhinos by the end of the testing process in like the last week was that I felt really frustrated in trying to figure out a way to gain an edge in the mirror. Yes, I was playing like 4 to 5 counter spells, but they all felt somewhat just kind of mediocre in the way that it's like, yeah, Mystical Dispute is good like 60% of the time or whatever, but sometimes it's just really awkward, especially if you're on the draw and like it's hard to line up. And it felt like we could just do better and that it just wasn't that efficient. It's like if we know that Rhinos is 20% of the metagame, surely we can come up with something better than just like a handful of counterspells. And that seemed to be the solution that basically was agreed upon both in testing and just in the public.
I have some thoughts, yeah. So I do think that you can actually get a huge edge in the mirror. So I played it 8 times in that weekend. It was the match I was most excited to see, and I went 7-1 in mirrors. Um, I think there's sort of like two classes of the Teamer Rhinos mirror, where one is you play against somebody who has kind of clearly not played enough of the mirror and is using the old heuristics. So like the most common play pattern would be we both ice each other or something, and then they cast Violent Outburst in my upkeep when I have 3 mana. And it used to be like that was acceptable because okay, what am I gonna do? If I have 2 mana, then I can do nothing. It resolves. If I
Right.
have 3 mana, then they're like, oh, what is he gonna hard cast? Force of Negation, and then you put Tishana's Tidebinder on the table.
Yeah, it's just GG.
It's GG. So just being able to think about what range of everything is happening is like the first level. Once you realize where all the cards are and what is actually punishing and what isn't. Then there's like the second class where you're playing as players who are like very prepared for the mirror and have clearly practiced it and understand the breakpoints. And that's where I think you need to have a more comprehensive plan for the mirror almost. So I was playing a bunch of testing for the mirror, and the conclusion that I came to is that it actually was ultimately a land drops mirror, and that whoever made more of their land drops was going to win because every single one of the breakpoints mattered. Your third land drop is obviously pretty important. The fourth land drop enabled Mystical Dispute, which was huge. The fifth land drop enabled Ice or Murktide, which was huge. So this is obviously, it was defined by you cast one of your 3 mana spells, and then what can you tack on? 6, you can double spell, etc.
Yeah, totally. Getting to 6 mana is crucial. I do not to fully disagree with your point, but I do feel like there's like 20% of games where one player could just be stuck on 3 lands and it would be totally fine. Because they're just like jamming cascaders or like they're just one spelling a turn and then just like casting 2 force negations that game. And that's just good enough.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a match of Magic. Some amount of the games are not really in your control. Um, the like double force of negation games are pretty silly. Sometimes you can beat that though, when both players have the nuts. It's actually better, I think, to be on the force of negation side of those nuts, right? So it's like if both players have the triple cascader hand, it's better to be the double cascader plus force of negation hand because you just have more rhinos left in your deck
Yep, totally.
afterwards.
Hmm.
But I
Well,
think the mirror is very interesting and it produces some pretty beautiful and interesting games.
yeah, I found the Rhinos Mirror to be pretty fun. There's like some amount of games where both players nut draws, but the like closer games can be very fun to navigate because they just felt like a game of limited to me. Um,
It's interesting.
is there anything else you wanted to do about like decks you were considering, or in that
I
general area?
I think I knew I was going to play rhinos, and then the cards that you can play are pretty reasonable. I think you came to the same sort of conclusion, right? It's not like there's any wild innovations.
Right.
So after that, it was just about having a plan for all the matchups,
Hmm.
and there was some real areas where I think we came to some conclusions that were better than what was publicly available. The two that jump out to mind the most being not boarding in endurance in the mirror
Yep.
and not boarding out force of negation against Yogg. Force
Yep.
of negation would be the card I'm most excited to see, or like the card that I think is like it's pivotal for the matchup, and a lot of the guides and discourse people that I talk to are like, oh yeah, I cut force of negation against Yogg, and that's
Well,
why you
I
lose to
think
Yogg.
it's really non-intuitive for that one specifically because it's like, they're the creature deck, but then it's like
The
post
only
board they have like eight things that you 1000% want a force negation, and it's like, well, yeah, the volume of targets they have is not very high, but every single non-creature spell they have in their deck post board is basically just a must counter. And it's like, you're like, well, if they know you're leaving in force negation, maybe they'll cord on your turn. It's like, well, if they're
Nope.
cording on my turn, I can just hard cast the force. Like, that's
Yeah,
still a good outcome.
and that was
Um,
basically the conclusion that we came to after playing a bunch of games against Devon
right.
was who was playing Yogg is all the games where Cord didn't resolve, basically all of them, the Rhinos player would win. So what do? You leave in your spell that stops Cord from resolving.
Right. Cord's very good. Um, yeah, I agree with that. I think there's always some room for, improvement and efficiency over whatever's just stock to the public. I mean, unfortunately, like, there's just a lot of misinformation out there, and putting the only way to really come to these kinds of conclusions, I think, is just a mix of applying theory and then properly putting in the work yourself to test these matchups one by one. Like, you're kind of just in the ground floor, of putting in the work, and the benefit for that is often these like slight optimizations that can really add up over the course of the tournament. Because like you said, imagine you, instead of playing the Random's Mirror, you played Yogg 8 times, and then it's like that difference in force negation could clean you up like two or three post board games. But that can be the difference between two or three match wins, and it's like that could be a tournament right there. That could be a nine. What was it? 9-8, 9-7, 9-6. What was, you need 11-3 to qualify, right?
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. 10-3, no, 10-4 or 11-3, whatever. That can be the difference right there. Um, but another part that I kind of wanted to speak about was effective teams, and like, when you're testing, how do you efficiently get to the bottom of a matchup? And like, I think there's some important parts about this. One is, I think balancing dice rolls somewhat can be kind of important. I think having open deck list or closed deck list based off of what event you're playing. I think also making sure that both players are both technically playing well and then also doing sideboard plans that are representative of what you expect to see in the tournament. Because I've had issues in the past where it's like, I will be working on a deck and I'll be making changes from stock, but when I make changes from stock, my opponent then can't take, like, the example of this was Pieces of the Puzzle in Phoenix versus Picklock. I played a bunch of red black mid range on Pieces, thought that my Phoenix deck was favored way more than it actually was if it was playing Picklock, and then my teammates got bad data because they were playing versus a version of Phoenix that was not what the majority was going to be playing at Atlanta. So you gotta be conscious of that, and then also I think people are like broadly way too into playing 12, 10, 12, even like 20 games, and then making these really like large win rate conclusions, being like, well, Scam won 13 and Amulet won 7, so clearly Scam is 70-30 in this matchup. It's like 20 games is like nothing in sample. Like, even the like big tournament data can be very noisy at times because you'll have these matchups that just don't quite look right if you play the format enough. So trying to, instead of extrapolate for specific outcomes, getting a general understanding of what things push the matchup in a certain direction, why those things are pushing that matchup in that certain direction, and then kind of thinking about how likely it is. Because it's like a good example of this is for Scam, when it had the 30 to 40% that you were scamming, and you thought about, okay, in that subsection of games, so it's like 40%. I think it's somewhere in the middle, but whatever. 40% of games I scam. How often am I winning when I'm scamming? Okay, let's add how much I'm winning when I'm scamming, that like just that probability, and then add it to the games where I don't scam, but I still have a good draw. And then if we combine those, do I think that lines up well into my opponent? And if it does, that means my win rate is probably pretty good because I'm scamming a decent amount. And then when I'm not scamming but still have a good draw, if that's still getting there, then that means that my baseline in this matchup has to be very high because that accounts for like 60% of games.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my general approach for testing matchups is to play a bunch, like one focused testing session is a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of games. So like 4 pre-board games and then 8 post-board games or something like that,
Yeah.
where you switch who's on the play or the draw both times. When we were testing Rhino's mirrors, we did big chunks. It's
Right.
like six of the one player on the draw, 6 of the one player on the play, because you have to swap the gemstone caverns in and out
Mm-hmm.
based on player draw, and so it was more efficient to just lock them all in. But the biggest thing is, I think one thing that I used to do that I've tried to do less now is draw my conclusions immediately. So it used to be like, okay, you play one match, and then I say, oh, that played out this way. I think that I lose the games where I get scammed, for example.
Right.
I've found it to be better to play large chunks of games under whatever paradigm understanding I have of the matchup at that time, and then you can go and reevaluate it. There's just too much variance and ways cards lined up and ways draws lined up to draw like rock solid conclusions out of a single match. And so it's better to try and adjust everything after like maybe having 3 or 4 or 5 games to look at a broader sample of.
Yeah, totally. I think also in a similar role, one of the most important things a team can have is the training dummy, which is kind of ironic because often the training dummy is like the smartest person on the team because it's the person who's willing to play any deck, be that jack of all trades, and then provide the valuable data, matchup data that you need to come to effective conclusions on the team. Someone that I see who does that a lot for like system magic is MSJ. MSJ, um, I would say, is both an extremely well-rounded player, but also, from what I can tell, is very agnostic on what they're willing to register. Like they just ripped off Living End for this event. I think they played Black Red Midrange in the past and Pioneer. They played Mono Green some, and they're like a pretty big limited player. And from what I can tell, they are both very ruthless in their deck selection, and their baseline for technical magic gameplay is like super high. So like having someone on your team where you can just hand them like any deck and then they'll just provide you with like accurate testing data is stupidly valuable. Like, to go to the complete contrary, I think Tristan's a very good technical player, but he is also a mad scientist in the way that he'll do things that are completely off the beaten path. And he definitely hits sometimes, but 9 out of 10 times, Tristan can be spending time on things that are not guaranteed to provide value to the team immediately. And it feels almost like the complete opposite with MSJ, where every time I play a set with MSJ, I walk away thinking, wow, I really learned something new, or like I can come to a new conclusion about this. And the way that can help form a team, especially if they are more free on their availability, it can be just super high value to have someone who can just flex in, play whatever you need to answer those important questions. Because once you figure out what your questions are about a deck, like for me, the Rhinos thing was like, well, can I find anything that can beat Rhinos and still not suck? And my conclusion to that was not really. So then it was like, okay, well, how do we break Rhinos? And MSJ was great for like figuring out or ruling out other things because he just has that super great baseline. Outside of the training dummy, I think some really important roles on a team could be like leader, um, kind of obvious, but someone who organizes meetings, team dinners, uh, like both deck specific meetings and the general meetings, sideboard plans, and I think also outside of that specifically, helping there be some cohesion in what the team is doing. I feel like you don't need to be specifically playing games to be a leader or be talking a ton, but someone who like sees what's going on and then helps push towards an effective allocation of resources within the team because there's a limited amount of time for each Magic tournament, and then having the larger foresight from like a top-down view to be able to be like, hey, maybe only having 8 people on Rhinos and 1 person on anything else is an inefficient use of our time. 9 weeks out from this event, maybe we should explore other stuff, or vice versa. Hey guys, it's 2 weeks before the event. We should really finalize what we're playing and stop messing around with Jink, and then like buckle down, figure out our sideboard plans, figure out what matchups we need to like really grind out to get those last couple sideboard cards. And giving that effective leadership can be really important.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense to me. Um, Team dynamics are pretty interesting, and I'm not actually sure how much edge I think there is to be gained from optimizing team dynamics, but I've definitely had good experiences in the teams that I've enjoyed.
Well, what do you mean optimizing?
I think outside of it, it may be true that outside of certain baseline features like having enough good people and having people be invested, that, for example, a team of 8 Rhinos players and 1 Living End player, it's not so I guess I'm interested more in the idea that you do you think there is a lot of edge to be gained by having sort of an optimal team?
What does optimal team mean?
Well, I definitely don't know that, but so you were describing these roles: leader, and then scientist, and training dummy.
Right, sure. So, if I had to imagine, I think an like ideal team would be probably around 8 to 12 people. Maybe a little bit less if there was really high investment. But if I was testing for a PT, I'd probably want to run a draft pod roughly. Um, and inside of that, I would probably want one mad scientist, one leader, and frankly, like 6 hardworking training dummies, because unfortunately, like in my opinion, the best thing you can be doing at a lot of Magic events is just showing up with a really well tuned version of whatever the best positioned deck is. There feels like less equity to be gained sometimes on brewing when compared to just showing up with really good lists. Like, I think a good example of that was when Fable was legal in standard. My impression from day one of that format was you were not getting me to not register Fable and Bankbuster. So, because I just thought those cards were significantly better than most other stuff in the format. I thought Rafine was like a very good card too. But I was like, hey, I think these are the best cards in the format. I just want to find the best shell for these cards. And like Blood Tithe Harvester 2 is another one where it's like I think that card's just very good. So rather than trying to like go sift through random uncommons for really potent synergies, I would rather just spend my time tuning something that's already proven and very powerful and having like the people working on the big stuff so that you can't have that one mad scientist if they hit go off can be nice. But if a team has 8 mad scientists, it just doesn't function and then there's just no good baseline deck to play at the event.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. I'm basically never gonna register a brew for any modern tournament.
Like,
Play a good list of a good deck.
sure. I don't know. I feel like I could be like, do you think Rainbow Rhinos was a brew?
No.
Okay. Do you think CFT Sock's deck was a brew?
Yes.
Would you register a CFT Sock deck if they said it was good?
Probably not. So I think the thing that is missing from what you had described, at least for me, for my own self, is you said that the most equity is to be gained by showing up with the best list of the best deck, and I think that's true. But I also think the most equity is to be gained from showing up with the best list of the best deck with the best play.
Sure.
And I would not play 68 card Splendid Reclamation Kirk at the level necessary to win this tournament. Unlike
Right.
CFP Puck. So even if they told me the deck was broken, maybe if they told me enough time ahead, I would play 5,000 games and be at that level. But if it was sitting down for round one and they said, here's this deck, I've already registered your deck list, I would be in tough shape, I think.
Right, right. I mean, I assume there's some context here. Would 2 weeks be enough? Would a month be
Probably.
enough? Where's the line here?
It depends on the deck for sure. I think the most interesting thought example for me was Living End for the RC in Denver. Had a great weekend, obviously. A lot of rhinos in the room. Good day to be a Living End player. There were sort of rumblings that Living End was going to be really well positioned. I sort of knew that it was going to be making a comeback. But even if I think you had told me, let's say Thursday, hey, Rhinos is going to be 22% of the room, which I think is about where it ended up. If you told me Thursday, okay, go play 48 hours of Living End and then register for this tournament, I think that I would actually be better prepared. Or I would have a better expected win rate playing the Rhinos deck that I've been preparing than switching to Living End at the last minute.
Yeah. I think I would draw the line somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks on. I mean, this also kind of depends on how much free time I have, but
Yeah.
somewhere in there is where it's like I I would imagine somewhere between 30 and 100 matches is where I start to really zone in on comfortableness with the deck.
Yeah.
And being comfortable isn't necessarily always great. I have noticed sometimes that when I get to like the hundreds of game matches benchmark with a deck, that my play can sometimes decline because I'll be autopiloting too much. But broadly, there is like a certain threshold of games required to get that like decent baseline of general heuristics for a deck, especially for something as weird as Living End. We are at 40 minutes and we haven't even gotten to post tournament, so we either need to speed this up or cut out the 75K. Um, I
Maybe
think,
we can talk about standard another time.
yeah, that sounds good. Okay, so how did the RC go for both of us? I went 4-4. Don't think I played very well in some of my losses. Uh, Thought my list was good. I ended up playing Rainbow Rhinos. I also think that the list I played could have had slightly better mana base, a little bit better plans. Um, yeah, I don't know. I felt pretty happy about where I ended up for the tournament, even though the technical play was a little bit like holding back for myself. And in terms of controlling stuff outside of the game, I don't know. Like day one, I didn't really feel that in the zone, but I'm not really sure there was like anything specific that was like I could have managed this better. I was very hot, but also just the like tournament hall was super hot, and I'm like not super sure if that's something I can be like I can really improve on that because it's like the AC was just broken was what I was told. Um,
They were turning up the heat actively, but I don't know.
Whoa. Okay. Well, yeah. I don't know. I just remember that place was cooking by like round five. Yeah. I don't know. You ended up playing stock rhinos, right? So how did you feel about that?
Yeah, I did not audible onto the crazy deranged leyline rhinos. I feel comfortable in that decision. I think Team of Rhinos was and is just a really, really solid deck for the reasons that we talked about earlier. So I actually showed up and LCQ'd on Friday. Um, had some nice games and won all 5 matches to be able to play the main event. Started out 0-2, battled back to 5-2, and then lost the tragic last game of the day. Largely, I punted pretty badly up a game in not a great matchup in a spot where I think if I had slept more the night before, eaten anything all day, and been able to force myself to focus in the eighth round of a tournament, that I probably would not have made the mistake that I made and would have basically instantly won the game. So that felt pretty bad.
Yeah.
But then I was indecisive between the standard and modern 10Ks the next day. Ended up deciding that I wanted redemption. Played stock Team of Rhinos in the 10K and went all the way there. So got some nice cash money to end the weekend, even if the actual main event itself didn't go my way.
Pretty sick. Yeah. I mean, would you say that you're happy about your deck choice in hindsight?
Yeah, it performed pretty well for me. The win rate was good. Felt not ideal. I played Living End twice on day one of the main event, which was not ideal. But I think the deck is just extremely reasonable, and having good plans and understanding the dynamics of all the decks that you're playing against will just take you so far with the deck.
Right. And I do feel like the RC is a place where technical play has more of an edge to be gained when compared to something like the PT. I feel like there's somewhere in like the top like 100-ish of the PT where it feels like you're starting to reach the like upper limit of technical play, and you kind of need to start exploring other areas to gain an advantage, such as deck construction. Or like in limited, there's a lot of stuff you can do. But for something like the RC, I mean, the player pool is just like much softer, so there's a lot more opportunity to just show up with good level 1 stuff and then just crush it anyways. I think that's also part of the reason why I would be much more hesitant to register a brew at an RC than a PT, because I think there's more impetus to innovate at a PT. But that still doesn't mean that you can't just register something stock for the PT. I mean, Phoenix at the last one was the most played deck and had like a 57% win rate, right? Like, think about that. Like, how many people were like, oh, Phoenix sucks, like whatever, and then it just like shows up and crushes, and it's like, nah, this deck is just very good.
Yeah, I think that's basically my experience with Rhinos, right? Is 20% of the room played Rhinos, 80% of the room thought they were going to beat Rhinos, and they didn't. And I do think that, so Rhinos, I think, posted like a 49.8%, or basically a dead on team of Rhinos posted a 50% win rate. I think the narrative after that was that it had a bad weekend despite winning the event. I think two big factors in that were one, uh, like 30 or so players switched off of Teamer to four color Rhinos literally on the last day. And if you think about who those 40 players are, I think those players are well above 50% win rate,
Right.
expected win rate in that field, right? So that's not only is that going to bolster the four color Rhinos win rate, it's
It's
going
gonna
to
take
drag
down.
down.
I think also part of it is like as the most popular deck should generally trend towards 50%.
It
Like,
regresses because of mirrors and all that sort of
right.
thing.
Yeah, it just like regresses to the mean in a lot of ways because the average win rate should be right around 50%. And especially when you consider like I don't know, just the if you take like two very average players and everyone is gunning for Rhinos, there's like some amount of like I don't know. It just makes sense to me that the top deck almost always averages out to around 50%, unless there's something like clearly up with the format. I mean, when the most played deck is also like 55% after being targeted for like multiple months. It's like if you saw in the European RC that I think Rhinos had a above 50% win rate, and I think it's because people weren't really as prepared for Rhinos, but it was such a known quantity going into the American RC that it was like if Rhinos still had like a 54% win rate, it would be I think almost grounds for a banning at that point because it's like all right, we've gave the format time to adjust. They've been trying to adjust, and Rhinos just still is clearly the best thing to be doing. And I think it's at least a little bit closer now, and if that's just fully true.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think Rhino's very, very good deck. Happy with how it played for me. Won some cool games. That's the thing that I like most about the deck. I was memed after for posting in a group of friends that Rhinos is a beautiful deck that produces beautiful games. But it's exactly the kind of magic that I find to be interesting and I like to play.
Yeah, totally.
When that sort of thing is also really good,
Great.
what more can I ask for?
Right. All right. Well, this was a great recording, and hopefully we can follow up with the standard stuff somewhat soon. Take care,
Yeah,
Joseph.
great talking to you as always, Derek.
Yeah.